1999 was a surprisingly warm year in New York. The September sun was gilding the tops of the skyscrapers when Liam Davenport first saw her. A slender brown woman in a slim business suit was trying to make her way through the revolving doors of a Manhattan business center, holding a dictaphone in one hand and an impressive stack of documents in the other. Dahlia Sloan was late for her first serious interview. The aspiring financial journalist had a chance to talk to a rising star of the investment market, and she couldn't miss it. However, fate had it differently. A gust of wind blew her papers across the hall, and instead of the planned interview with the CEO, she ran into a young man who rushed to help her gather documents. Looking up, Dahlia met the smiling stranger's gaze. His gray eyes radiated warmth and some special light. His dark hair was carelessly ruffled, and his impeccable suit from a famous designer bore a badge that read Liam Davenport, CEO. Their first meeting lasted more than 3 hours. Dahlia received not only an exhaustive interview about the formation of a young investment company, but also an invitation to dinner. Liam spoke about finance with such passion that even complex economic terms sounded like poetry in his mouth. He told how 5 years ago he had met Gregory Frost, an experienced broker who had believed in him and helped him start his own business. Gregory often dropped by the office, even though he was technically only a consultant. A tall, trim man in his 50s, he exuded confidence and had an easygoing demeanor. He became for Liam not just a business partner, but a true mentor and friend. It was Frost who taught him the main principle. Trust and reputation are the most important things in business. The romance of Liam and Dahlia developed rapidly. They seemed to complement each other. His thoroughness and business acumen perfectly combined with her energy and ambition. Dahlia quickly settled into the world of big business. Her articles attracted more and more attention. And Liam never tired of admiring how accurately she could convey the essence of complex financial processes in simple language. 3 months later, they got married. The wedding was modest, only 20 guests in an old mansion on the outskirts of the city. Gregory Frost made a touching toast, calling their union an ideal partnership. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Europe, visiting Paris, Vienna, and Venice. Dahlia was glowing with happiness, and Liam could not look at his wife. Back in New York, they bought a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Liam's business flourished. His instinct for promising projects seemed unmistakable. Dahlia left her job at a magazine and began writing a book on modern trends in investing. They were considered the perfect couple, young, successful, in love. In the evenings, they liked to sit on the terrace, admiring the city lights. Liam shared his plans for the company's expansion, and Dahlia talked about her book. Sometimes Gregory joined them. He lived in the neighborhood and often came over for dinner. On such evenings, they could discuss new projects and market prospects for hours. It seemed that a long and happy life lay ahead of them. No one could suppose that this idyll would last less than a year. But for now, the newlyweds enjoyed every day, made plans, and believed in the infinity of their happiness. Liam was sure that he had met the woman of his dreams. He didn't notice the gradual change in Dahlia's gaze as she looked at the prosperous clients of his company. Didn't pay attention to her frequent inquiries about the details of deals and financial flows. Love made him blind and his trust in his wife absolute. Dark maroon curtains dimmed the light in the Empire restaurant. Dahlia ran her finger thoughtfully along the rim of her martini glass, furtively scrutinizing her companion. Emmett Rutledge was impeccable, an expensive suit that fit like a tailored suit. The gray hair on his temples only added to his nobility, and golden sparks flickered in his dark eyes. "You do realize your husband is nothing but a lucky upstart, don't you?" His husky, British accented voice was hypnotic. Gregory Frost gave him a chance, and what do we have? A kid who thinks he's a financial genius. Dahlia wrinkled her nose. She remembered admiring Liam's energy and assertiveness as recently as 6 months ago. But after meeting Rutledge, everything had changed. Liam had seemed naive and simple next to this man who radiated power and authority. "I'm offering you a future, darling, a real future, not a life in the shadow of a shallow husband." Rutledge covered her palm with his. "We need only remove the extra pieces from the board." The plan was brutal and simple. Frost knew too much, suspected too much. Rutledge explained every detail, how the documents would be forged, how the gun would end up in Liam's office, how witnesses would corroborate his threats against his partner. All I need is your testimony, my dear. An inconsolable wife forced to testify against her beloved husband. That would be the perfect point. That evening, when the shots rang out, Dahlia sat at home. She methodically repeated the memorized text about the overheard conversation, about her husband's strange behavior, about his nervousness in recent weeks. Liam had indeed stopped by Frost's place. She'd made sure the cameras caught it herself. I asked the court to pay attention to Mrs. Davenport's testimony. The prosecutor's voice tingled with triumph. A woman who found the courage to, Dahlia cried on the witness stand. Tears rolled down her cheeks, her voice shaking. She spoke of love, of disappointment, of how she couldn't believe what had happened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Liam's frozen face. Dahlia, look at me. His voice sounded muffled. Look me in the eyes and tell me you believe I'm guilty. She looked up. There was pain in Liam's gray eyes, the pure, unadulterated pain of a betrayed man. That look would haunt her nightmares. There was absolute silence as the judge read out the sentence. 25 years, rigorous imprisonment. Liam didn't say a word, just stared long, hard, as if trying to solve a riddle. Congratulations, darling. Rutledge was waiting for her outside the courthouse. You were great. His kiss reverberated with bitterness. Dahlia tried to smile, but her lips wouldn't obey. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a doubt stirred. Had she made the right choice? But it was too late. The mechanism was started, and it worked perfectly. The divorce papers were on the judge's desk in a week. Another month later, the company was taken over by Rutledge, and in the fall, the society columns were full of photos of the new couple. You won't regret a thing, Emmett whispered, slipping a huge diamond ring on her finger. Dahlia nodded and smiled, but in front of her eyes was still that last look in Liam's eyes, the look of a man who'd lost not just his freedom, but his faith in love. And somewhere in the corridors of a federal prison, the new inmate Davenport was methodically scribbling notches on a wall, day after day, week after week. He had plenty of time, 25 whole years to think about his revenge. The huge windows of the Park Avenue penthouse reflected the sunset. Dahlia Rutledge stood at the panoramic glass, absent-mindedly adjusting her impeccable styling. She hadn't changed much in 25 years, the same slender figure, the same haughty look. Only in the corners of her eyes there were barely perceptible wrinkles, and in her brown hair the gray was masterfully hidden. Mrs. Rutledge, the charity gala starts in an hour, the assistant reminded. Your performance is scheduled for 9. Dahlia nodded, scrutinizing her reflection. The Chanel dress fit flawlessly. A pink diamond necklace glittered around her neck, a gift from Emmett last Christmas. What's the change in the guest list? She ran her finger carelessly over the cold glass. The governor has confirmed attendance. And yes, Forbes magazine is sending a photographer. They're doing a feature on the city's most powerful women. Dahlia grinned. Her social standing was impeccable. Editor-in-chief of Style and Power Fashion magazine. Trustee of 3 charitable foundations. Wife of one of the richest men on the East Coast, impeccable reputation, impeccable style, impeccable life. Honey, are you ready? Emmett Rutledge appeared in the study doorway. The years had hardly touched him. The same military bearing, the same penetrating gaze. Only the gray hair had grown back, and the wrinkles had deepened. Do you remember that night 25 years ago? He asked suddenly, coming closer. When we first started? Dahlia shuddered. She tried not to remember that time, tried to forget Liam's eyes at the trial, his last look of pain and bewilderment. We got everything we wanted. Emmett's voice sounded smug. The company has grown tenfold. Have you seen the latest quotes? She nodded. Liam's former company, now part of the Rutledge empire, was indeed thriving. Emmett was proving to be a brilliant strategist. Every decision he made was profitable. And that your first husband? Emmett pursed his lips. He's supposed to be released today, isn't he? Dahlia froze. She carefully chased the thoughts away from her, but the date was seared into her memory. February 11th, 2025. He's a nobody. Her voice sounded almost convincing. A broken man who served a quarter of a century. What difference does it make? Emmett looked at his wife carefully. You're right, dear. It's just a funny coincidence that on the day of his release, we're having a reception in honor of the Goldman Sachs takeover. Ironic, don't you think? Dahlia turned away to the window. Below, the lights of evening Manhattan twinkled. Her realm, her world built on the ruins of someone else's life. The car's waiting, Emmett reminded her. We should go. In the huge room of the Plaza Hotel, the city's entire financial behemoth had gathered. Dahlia floated between groups of guests, dispensing smiles and compliments. She was in her element, a brilliant socialite, an impeccable hostess for the evening. A terrific reception, Mrs. Rutledge. The elderly banker raised his champagne glass. Your husband has done the unbelievable, such a consummation of the century. Oh, yes, she smiled. Emmett knows how to get his own way, how very skillful he is. Dahlia remembered the meticulousness with which he'd planned every step, from killing Frost to forging documents. Everything had worked perfectly. They'd gotten the company, the reputation, the power. Mrs. Rutledge, the Forbes photographer asked her to pose. You are so elegant. She stood at the column, turning her head slightly. A professional smile, a polished gesture. The evening was in full swing when Dahlia's phone vibrated quietly. A message from her assistant. Turn on the news. In the restroom, hiding the phone screen, she watched a short report. The camera showed the gates of a federal prison, a tall figure in a dark jacket. Liam hadn't changed much, the same straight back, the same confident stride. Only his hair was completely gray, and his eyes... There was something new, unfamiliar about them. Honey, you have guests waiting for you. Emmett peered into the restroom. Is something wrong? No. She hid her phone. Everything's fine. The evening continued. Dahlia smiled, made toasts, accepted compliments. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a forgotten fear was stirring. For 25 years, she had tried not to think about that day, about her betrayal, about the man she had once loved. And now he was free, and somehow she was sure this wasn't the end of the story. Late at night, lying awake in her luxurious bedroom, Dahlia stared into the darkness. Emmett was snoring beside her, his wedding anniversary gift bracelet glimmering with diamonds on the bedside table. She'd built the perfect life, became the person she'd always wanted to be. Why now, a quarter of a century later, does her heart clench with fear? Why does that last look in the courtroom keep coming back to her? Sleep, silly, she whispered to herself. He's nothing, just a ghost of the past. But sleep did not come. The night city flickered outside the window, and the question played over and over in her head. What would happen now? The metal gate clanked one last time. Liam Davenport stepped outside the prison, squinting against the bright winter sun. 9,125 days, 219,000 hours. Every minute he remembered what he was living for. In the worn leather bag were all his belongings, a change of underwear, a few books, old photographs, and a black-covered notebook, each page scribbled in small handwriting. For a quarter of a century, he'd learned patience, observation, and waiting. Mr. Davenport, your cab. The warden waved toward the yellow car. Good luck on your freedom. Liam nodded. There was an envelope of money in his jacket pocket, a small amount of money for released prisoners. It would be enough for the first time. To Brooklyn, he tossed to the cabbie. Bushwick neighborhood. The city had changed beyond recognition. New skyscrapers jutted into the sky. Old buildings disappeared. Only the people remained the same, still scurrying down the streets, staring at their phones. The apartment he'd found through the social worker was small but clean. Third floor of an old building, windows overlooking a quiet courtyard. The neighbors were an elderly couple and a young family with a child. The papers are in order, Mr. Bishop. The landlady held out her keys. House rules are simple. Quiet after 10 o'clock. No parties. Alan Bishop. New name, new life. 5 years before his release, he'd met the right man. Michael Hunter, serving time for document forgery. From him, Liam learned who he could turn to when he was free. He had money. Over 25 years of working in the prison library, laundry, and kitchen, he'd saved up a decent sum. The documents weren't cheap, but the quality was worth it. The cover story was impeccable. Liam methodically laid out his things. He hung up his only suit. He had an interview at an investment firm tomorrow. A small firm, one of the branches of the Rutledge Empire, where no one would remember a high-profile case from 25 years ago. In the evening, he stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the falling asleep city. Somewhere out there, in a luxurious penthouse, Dahlia was preparing for a social gathering. He'd seen pictures of her in magazines. Time had barely touched her beauty. Only her eyes had gotten harder and her smile colder. "You didn't think I'd just disappear, did you?" He whispered into the darkness. "That I'd forget? What will I forgive?" In the morning, he shaved thoroughly, put on his suit. The mirror reflected a tall, gray-haired man with a straight back and a calm gaze. No one would have recognized him as the young financier whose picture had once made the front pages of the newspapers. "Mr. Bishop, impressive resume." The department head flipped through the paperwork. "Your work experience?" "I've been in private consulting for the last few years," he said, his voice steady, his gaze confident. "Prefer smaller companies where I can focus on the details." He got the job the same day. Small office, computer, stacks of reports. He plunged headfirst into his work, quickly gaining a reputation as an incisive analyst, able to find the slightest discrepancies in documents. "Mr. Bishop checks every figure so thoroughly," he heard the chatter in the office. A true professional. In the evenings, Liam read the financial news, studied the socialite news, watched interviews with Rutledge and his wife. Every detail, every phrase casually dropped could be important. He became a frequent visitor to the public library, spending hours studying old newspaper files. 25 years ago, the press had written extensively about his case. Now those articles were revealing new details unnoticed then. "Good morning, Mr. Bishop," the receptionist smiled affably. "Would you like coffee?" He was always polite but kept aloof. No personal conversations, no company parties. A quiet, efficient employee who, after a month, was no longer noticed. 3 months flew by. He got used to his new life, the freedom, the city. Every morning began with watching the news. Every evening ended with notes in a black notebook. In his desk drawer was an envelope written in elegant handwriting, an invitation to a fundraiser at the Plaza Hotel, a social gathering of the city's financial bohemond. "Soon, my love." Liam ran his finger along the gold embossing of the invitation. "Very soon we'll meet." Outside the window, February snow was falling, covering the city in a white blanket. The time of waiting was over. The real story was beginning. A woman's shrill scream tore through the morning silence of the Rutledge mansion. Maria, the maid who had come to wake her mistress for breakfast, froze in the bedroom doorway. Dahlia Rutledge's body was sprawled on the white sheets in her evening gown, with a trace of lipstick on the glass by the bedside table. "Mrs. Rutledge." Maria shook her hostess by the shoulder. "Ma'am, please." The body was already cold. There was a dark mark on the graceful neck, a thin silk scarf twisted in a harness lying beside the bed. An hour later, the mansion was filled with people. Uniformed cops, forensic scientists in white jumpsuits, plainclothes detectives. Emmett Rutledge, pale and confused, testified in the study. "I was in Boston." His hoarse voice trembled. "Came back this morning. We talked on the phone last night. She was going to go to bed early." Detective Jasper Montgomery, a tall man with an attentive gaze, methodically recorded the statement. His partner, Letitia Hardy, was examining the bedroom with the forensics team. "Mr. Rutledge, the security cameras." "Disabled." Emmett nervously adjusted his tie. "Someone hacked into the security system. The guard didn't discover it until this morning." Montgomery glanced over to Hardy. "Professional job. The perimeter was down, the cameras silent, the alarms neutralized. The killer knew exactly what he was doing." "Time of death is between 11 and 1 a.m. The pathologist finished his examination. "Strangulation. Hardly any signs of struggle, just a broken fingernail and a bruise on the wrist." Letitia took a seat at the dressing table. Bottles of perfume, cosmetics, a comb with a few dark hairs. Nearby, an uncorked bottle of expensive wine and 2 glasses. "She wasn't alone," Hardy said quietly. "Someone kept her company." A crumpled napkin with the Plaza Hotel logo was lying on the floor beside the bed. The detective carefully unfolded it. Traces of lipstick, the same one on the glass. Check the guests at the fundraiser. Montgomery nodded at the napkin. Was she there last night? Yes. Rutledge sank heavily into his chair. Dahlia organized that reception. It went perfectly. She called me around 10, said she was on her way home. In the pocket of his evening gown, they found an invitation card, a crumpled check from the hotel bar, and his car keys. Ordinary little things, traces of an ordinary evening that had become her last. Security. Letitia reviewed the entries in her notebook. 2 men at the entrance, 1 circling the grounds. Perimeter cameras went off at 10:30. The alarm system was deactivated from the inside. Someone knew the codes, Montgomery frowned, and the layout of the house, and the security routines. Forensics worked in the bedroom, taking prints, collecting fibers, photographing every detail. Maria, still in shock, answered the police officer's questions in the kitchen. Mrs. Rutledge came back around 11. The maid blotted her eyes with a handkerchief. I asked if she needed anything. She asked for a bottle of wine from the cellar, said she wanted to relax before going to bed. Alone? Yeah. I don't know. I brought the wine and left, didn't hear anything else. Montgomery stood at the window, looking out over the manicured garden. The impeccable security system, the cameras, the guards and all had proved useless. The killer knew how to bypass the defenses, knew when Rutledge would be away, knew Dahlia's habits. Jasper, Letitia touched his shoulder. They found this in Mrs. Rutledge's car. She held out a small envelope sealed with red wax. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a single phrase printed on an old typewriter. Retribution is a dish served cold. Check the guest list from the reception. Montgomery tucked the envelope into an evidence bag. Every single one of them. Who talked to her, who danced, who was just around, and find the video from the hotel cameras. The day stretched on endlessly. Forensics were finishing their work. Police were interviewing maids and guards. Dahlia's body was being taken to the morgue. Emmett Rutledge locked himself in his office with his lawyer. Letitia got behind the wheel of the squad car. Montgomery settled in beside her. It was a 40-minute drive to the office. What do you think? She cast a quick glance at her partner. I think this isn't a random murder. Montgomery drummed his fingers on a file folder. Too well planned. Too personal. Outside the window, suburbia floated by. Rows of luxurious mansions, manicured lawns, high fences. A world where the rich felt safe. A world where even the best security system couldn't protect against revenge. Check her background. Jasper closed his eyes. Everything. Every year of her life. Every enemy. Every secret. Hardy nodded. Both knew. This was going to be a tough case. The killer had left no obvious trace, but he had left a message. And now it was their job to read it correctly. Detective Montgomery's office was in perfect order. A large board of photos, documents, and notes appeared on the wall. In the center was a picture of Dahlia Rutledge at a charity event. Next to it, a photo from the crime scene. So, what have we got? Letitia Hardy spread the file folders on the table. Emmett Rutledge was in Boston. His alibi is corroborated by dozens of people, a business dinner, then a meeting until late at night. Too perfect an alibi. Montgomery tapped his pencil on the desk thoughtfully. But it's worth checking. What else? There were about 200 people in attendance at the fundraiser. I've got the guest list, started a background check. Hotel security footage shows that Dahlia left the plaza at 10:15, alone. There was a knock on the door. A young officer brought in the forensic results. Traces of sleeping pills were found in the glasses. Montgomery ran his eyes over the report. A powerful drug, prescription. They also found traces of it in the victim's blood. She didn't resist, Letitia frowned, because she was already in a half-asleep state. Jasper walked over to the board, staring at the photos. Something was bugging him. The murder had been planned flawlessly, but at the same time, too theatrical. The note, the red wax, the quote about retribution. Check her background, he turned to his partner. Especially thorough the last 25 years. Hardy nodded and delved into the computer. An hour later, she looked up. Found something interesting. In the year 2000, Dahlia divorced her first husband, Liam Davenport. He was convicted of murdering a business partner, Gregory Frost. Got 25 years. Montgomery straightened sharply. When was he released? February 11th of this year, 3 months ago. 3. Silence hung in the office. Jasper did a quick calculation in his mind. The timing was just right. Enough time to plan, to prepare, to learn the victim's routine. Find him. He grabbed his jacket. Address, job, all contacts. I'm on my way to see Rutledge. Need to find out what he knows about his wife's first husband. Emmett Rutledge received the detective in the same office. He looked haggard, shadows under his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. Davenport? He wrinkled his nose. Of course I knew about him. Dahlia never hid her past. You knew he'd been released? Yes. Rutledge turned away to the window. We stepped up security when we found out. Dahlia was afraid. She never said it outright, but I could see her fear. Montgomery's phone vibrated. A message from Hardy. Checked the release address, a rental apartment in Bushwick, but he moved out of there 3 weeks ago. No sign of him. Mr. Rutledge, Jasper stepped forward. Tell me everything you know about the Frost case. Every detail. For the next hour, Rutledge talked, and the detective listened. The story was a familiar one. A young financier kills his partner over money. The wife testifies against the husband. Classic plot. Were you dating Dahlia before Frost's murder? Montgomery suddenly asked. Rutledge hesitated half a word. Something resembling fear flashed across his face. No, of course not. We met later when she was already available. Back at the office, Jasper found Letitia looking through old newspaper articles. It was a high-profile case. She slid the yellowed clippings over to him. But something doesn't add up. Look, the key piece of evidence, the gun with Davenport's prints on it, disappeared from the evidence room 5 years ago. And another, one of the prosecution's key witnesses died in a car accident a month after the trial. Montgomery looked thoughtfully at the photos from Frost's murder scene. Check out everyone connected to that case. The judge, the jury, the witnesses, who died, who disappeared, who suddenly got rich. You think Davenport's avenging an old case? I don't know. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. But 25 years is a long time to plan revenge, and the note? Revenge is served cold. Why those exact words? There was a knock at the door. The results of the forensic examination of the fibers from the crime scene had arrived. Nothing unusual. Hardy reviewed the report. Traces of expensive fabric, probably from the killer's suit. Also, they found microparticles of some kind of special soap on the scarf, the kind they use. In prisons, Montgomery finished. Find Davenport. Whatever it takes, find him. It was cool and quiet in the city courthouse archives. Letitia Hardy sat behind a desk piled with folders from 25 years ago. The Gregory Frost case took up 5 thick volumes. Here, I found this. She held out a yellowed sheet to Montgomery. Dahlia Davenport's original deposition. Read it carefully. Jasper read into the neat lines of the transcript. That night I heard a loud conversation. Liam was yelling at Gregory something about money. I was in the next room and clearly heard the threats. Now watch this. Hardy placed another document next to it. Her testimony in court, 3 months later. She's already saying she saw Liam leaving Frost's office with a gun. Where did the gun come from? Why the change in testimony? Montgomery frowned, comparing the documents. What else? The floor plan of the building. Letitia unfolded an old blueprint. Frost's office was in the far wing. It was separated from the room where Dahlia was supposedly in by 2 corridors and a hallway. It was physically impossible for her to hear the conversation. The archive smelled of dust and old paper. The detectives immersed themselves in studying the materials. Every document, every detail could prove important. Odd. Montgomery set aside another folder. Company financials. A month before the murder, Frost launched an internal investigation. Look, he requested an audit of all major transactions. And what did he find? Unknown. The audit results aren't in the file. But there is a curious detail. A week after the murder, the controlling interest in the company was transferred to the Rutledge Corporation. Letitia was taking quick notes. Wait a minute. If Frost suspected something, then he was dangerous, Montgomery finished. But not to Davenport, for someone else. They worked until late in the afternoon. The story that had seemed so clear 25 years ago was becoming more confusing by the hour. Here's the ballistics report. Hardy held out a folder. The gun was found in Davenport's office the day after the murder. The expert confirmed it was used to shoot Frost. But the fingerprints are too clear. It's as if someone deliberately gripped the handle. And then there's the gunpowder on Davenport's hands. He was tested right after his arrest, and there were traces of it. Except, only what? Forensics showed the shot was fired at least 6 hours before, and Davenport went to Frost's house 2 hours before the murder. Montgomery stood up, stretching his stiff back. Folders piled up on the desk, interrogation reports, forensics, photographs, the history of a crime for which a man had served a quarter century. Check the jury. He nodded at another stack of documents, especially their financial situation before and after the trial. An hour later, Letitia whistled quietly. Found it. 3 of the jurors paid off large loans right after the trial. 2 others bought real estate. The source of the money is unknown. And the judge? Retired after a year. Bought a house in Florida, officially an inheritance from his aunt. They looked at each other. The picture was getting ugly. Tampered evidence, altered testimony, bribed jurors. Now I see why he waited 25 years, Hardy said quietly. Gathered information. Preparing. Preparing for what? Montgomery went to the window. It was already dark, with only a desk lamp burning in the archives. For revenge or justice? There's one more thing. Letitia pulled out the last document. The medical report on Frost's death. Officially 2 shots to the chest, but there was another oddity, needle marks on his neck. They were written off as attempted resuscitation, but? There's no mention of any injection in the ambulance report. Frost was dead when they arrived. Montgomery returned to the table, looking at the 25-year-old crime scene photos. Something was escaping his attention, some important detail. Who performed the autopsy on Frost? Dr. Michael Stern. Died 5 years ago, heart attack. Very convenient. Jasper rubbed his temples. All the strings are being cut. All witnesses are silenced. The perfect crime. Which one? Hardy asked quietly. Frost's murder? Or convicting an innocent man? Outside the archive window, the wind howled. Somewhere in the city lurked a man who had lost a quarter century of his life. A man who now knew the truth. And that truth had cost the life of Dahlia Rutledge. Gather the files. Montgomery began to put the folders together. We need to find Davenport, before it's too late. Too late for what? For everyone, the detective replied quietly. For everyone who was involved in that story. Letitia Hardy sat at her computer, going through old financial reports from Frost's company. In 3 days of continuous work, she and Montgomery had pulled up every document they could get their hands on. Jasper, take a look at this. She turned the monitor around. $5 million in cash was withdrawn from a corporate account the week before Frost was killed. It wasn't Davenport who signed off on the transaction. He didn't have that authority. Frost's signature. Montgomery stared at the scan of the document. Who got the money? An offshore company. And guess who was its beneficiary? A small firm owned by Emmett Rutledge. Silence hung in the office. Jasper walked over to the board of photographs and documents. Now I see what Frost found during the audit. He tapped his finger on an old newspaper clipping. Asset fraud. Rutledge was moving money out through shell companies, and Frost dug up the scheme. And Dahlia was on Rutledge's side from the beginning. Montgomery picked up a folder of witness statements. Look, she changed her testimony after she met with the prosecutor. Then a week later, that same prosecutor bought a house in Manhattan. The value is $4 million. Hardy quickly checked the information. Bingo. The money came from the same offshore account. The phone rang on the desk. The lab expert had found something interesting in Dahlia's belongings. A page of faded entries was found in her 25-year-old diary. Letitia jotted down. The address of the hotel. Date is the day before Frost's murder. Meeting with ER. ER is Emmett Rutledge. Montgomery picked up his jacket. Let's go to the hotel. There may be some old logbooks preserved there. The Regent Hotel's archives smelled of dust and old paper. The elderly receptionist took a long time to find the right folder. Here. He placed a tattered logbook in front of the detectives. February 2000. The suite was booked in Mr. Rutledge's name. Who else stayed that day? Allow me. The receptionist put on his glasses. In the next room, Mrs. Davenport, Dahlia Davenport. Hardy wrote out the details. The day before Frost was killed, they met secretly. Planned? Not just planned. Montgomery looked over the invoices. Look, room service order. 2 glasses of champagne, dinner for 2. They were celebrating. Back at headquarters, the detectives continued to unravel the tangle of the old case. Every new detail confirmed that Liam Davenport was innocent. Here's the new ballistics expert's report. Hardy placed a fresh report on the table. He analyzed the old photos. The shots were fired from the left hand. Davenport is right-handed. And the gunpowder residue? Artificially applied. The expert says this particle distribution is impossible in a real gunshot. Montgomery stepped up to the board. The story was shaping up eerily. Dahlia and Rutledge had planned Frost's murder, framed Davenport, bought the witnesses and the judge. Why Frost? Letitia looked through old reports. I mean, he helped Davenport start the business. Because he was honest, Jasper sighed. He started an investigation into Rutledge's machinations, found evidence, was going to go to the SEC, and they took him down. And Davenport became the perfect scapegoat. Montgomery picked up a picture of a young Liam. 25 years in prison for someone else's crime, for betraying his wife, for Rutledge's greed. Hardy opened the last file. I found something else. After Frost died, his safe deposit box at the bank was opened by court order. Inside were documents proving Rutledge's guilt, but they mysteriously disappeared. Disappeared, or were they hidden? Do you think Davenport got to them? In 25 years, he could have found a way. Montgomery rubbed the bridge of his nose. Now, I see why Dahlia was so afraid of his release. She knew he'd find proof. The phone rang again in the office. Forensics had found something on Dahlia's computer. Old mail, Hardy wrote down quickly. Emails from 25 years ago. Correspondence with Rutledge. They planned the whole thing. Every detail. Montgomery stared silently out the window. Somewhere in the city lurked a man who knew the truth. A man who had lost everything because of someone else's greed and betrayal. Outside Montgomery's office window, dawn was breaking. For the last 3 nights, the detectives had barely slept, unraveling a tangle of 25 years. The phone rang on the desk. Montgomery, the voice in the receiver was calm and deep. This is Liam Davenport. I assume you're looking for me. Jasper put the phone on speaker, nodded to Hardy. The latter was already dialing up the extraction team. Where are you, Mr. Davenport? In the park near the waterfront. You know the bench overlooking the Statue of Liberty? I'll meet you there in an hour, alone. Montgomery found him exactly there, a tall, gray-haired man in a strict suit looking out over the water. A leather briefcase lay beside him. I knew you'd dig up the truth. Davenport didn't even turn around. You're a good detective, aren't you? As you should be in a story like this. You killed her. Yes, he finally looked at Montgomery. But that's only part of the story. The important part is in the briefcase. Inside were folders of documents, thumb drives, old letters, 25 years of painstaking labor, evidence of collusion, financial fraud, witness statements. The prison librarian has access to amazing resources, Davenport grinned. Prisoners like to talk. Guards do too, if you know the approach. I've been gathering information bit by bit. Why was it necessary to kill Dahlia? So you could start digging, he shrugged. Alive, she would have continued to pose as a socialite. Dead, she'd make you search for the truth. Sirens could be heard in the distance. The extraction team was closing in. You know what the funny thing is? Davenport pulled an envelope from his pocket. I've sent all the evidence to the editorial offices of the major newspapers. They'll be published in an hour. You'll go to jail for life. Perhaps, he smiled. But Rutledge will go down with me, and the truth will be known to all. As police officers ran up to the bench, Davenport calmly raised his hands. I killed Dahlia Rutledge. It was easy. She still believed she could manipulate me, invited me into the house, poured wine, just like old times. Montgomery snapped the handcuffs on his wrists. She didn't even realize the sleeping pills were in her glass, not mine, Davenport said smoothly, as if he were giving a lecture. When she realized it was too late, I wanted her to know why, to realize the cost of her betrayal. The department was already in turmoil. The story had blown up in the newsroom. The evidence was overwhelming: letters, bank records, witness statements. Rutledge's empire was crumbling before his eyes. Emmett was caught in his office, trying to destroy documents. But it was too late. Copies of everything had already gone to the editorial offices. 25 years, Davenport said as Montgomery closed the cell. They stole a quarter century from me. Now justice has been done. At the cost of another life. At the cost of a traitor's life, he lay back on the narrow bunk. You know, prison is a lot of time for reflection. I realized sometimes revenge and justice are the same thing. The next day, all the newspapers were full of headlines. The financial tycoon turned out to be a murderer, his wife a traitor, and a man who had served 25 years, innocent. The story got the closure it deserved. Liam Davenport got a life sentence. Emmett Rutledge got 30 years for Frost's murder and financial crimes. And somewhere in the city archives, an old case was gathering dust, a reminder that justice sometimes comes too late. But it always does.